Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Abbott, and I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us for today's On the Record program. It's my honor to welcome you to this program in our Hart Program Series on Latin America. This program would not be possible without the generous support of Rob and Kitty Lansing and their family. This new program series succeeds a fellowship program that was established in honor of Gus Hart, who served as a former chairman of the council. We are so grateful for the generosity of the Lansing and Hart families that has allowed the council to engage with leaders from Latin America and highlight the deep ties between Chicago and the region. And I want to thank the host committee for the Hart Program Series as well. Before we start the conversation, please note that the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We'll take questions from the audience after our moderated discussion, and if you'd like to submit a question, please type ccga.live into your web browser. We also have had some changes to our speaker roster since this program was initially announced, so I want to apologize for any inconvenience. Our timely topic today is the state of democracy in Latin America, and it is particularly relevant to this series given that one of the Council's former Hart Fellows, Felix Maradiaga, ran for president of Nicaragua earlier this year, but was arrested and became one of several opposition candidates to be detained. Joining us to share his insight on democracy in Latin America is another former Hart Fellow, Nicolas Ducote. Nico co-founded the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth in 2000, and later served as mayor of the municipality of Pilar, Argentina, his hometown. Nico, we're honored to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you to the Chicago Council, to the Lansing family, and to everyone that's joining us today.
Thank you. And for our first question, multiple countries in Latin America have been in the spotlight recently for shifts in democratic governance. What is the state of democracy in Latin America at the moment?
So overall, the region has probably 30, 40 years of stronger democratic practices than we did in the previous 30, 40 years. But we're still in a process of evolution of that democratic practice where we're not failing as much overall in the region in having elections and respecting the results of elections. But you do have some outliers. You were just mentioning Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, certain countries where being in opposition, challenging those in power is still a difficult part of civic engagement. And you have those countries like Uruguay or Costa Rica where the differences in political debate are settled in a very open and civilized democratic dialogue. And in the middle, we've seen shifts, as you just put in the question, in countries that have probably polarized their democratic bases. So you see more challenging coming together of more far-right expressions of popular preference and more far-left. Chile, in its current example of the constitutional reform and the current electoral scenario. Brazil, from the Lula experience to Bolsonaro and the challenges that brings about. The whole episodes we saw in the past few years in Bolivia, Evo Morales ousting the new government, the election process again, bringing the former administration. So we are having, if it were a pendulum with stronger swifts from left to right, and at the same time, without a sense of clear satisfaction by the citizenry that the different extremes of that political choice is producing the results. You don't see a consistent permanence. So if the pendulum swung more to the right in Argentina during 2015 to 2019, then it went in the other direction over these past few years. And still, as we'll probably be talking about later today, the sense that democracy is giving the results that society expects in terms of reduction of poverty, more opportunities, is still not there. If we look at democracy in Paraguay, again, we have the formalities of elections, but then we have the same parties ruling for decades and little challenge to the current system. And when the exceptions do occur, they usually don't finish the mandate. So we are presented with these situations where if we were making some kind of a strict evaluation of institutions of democracy, both from the perspective of the citizens, the different balance of power and between the judicial, the executive, the legislative branches, and the results that this is producing in terms of good governance and better policies, we still remain at challenging situation, and there is much more that needs to be done to strengthen our democratic practice in the region, learning from those that are doing things well and trying to correct those things where we still have shortcomings or we're still challenged.
Thank you very much. Speaking of that, what can citizens do to promote democratic renewal in countries that have experienced backsliding democracy?
So I think that the bigger underlying issue of your question is, how do we strengthen and involve more people in the democratic process? Because in as much as the political debate is only a debate that happens when elections occur, and we don't have civic engagement or community organizing to sustain the power of the people in our democratic practice, then the biggest threat becomes the disengagement, the lack of interest, the cynicism, the disbelief in a political class. And so it brings, in the different countries, a lack of participation and a lack of empowerment. And so, what can citizens do? And your question is inform themselves more about political issues. If there are possibilities of participating at the local or state or national level in debates and security forums and economic progress initiatives, but to take that step from being bystanders into being active and engaged citizens. So that's one requisite. It requires information. It requires not only the ideal of participating or maybe logging on to a session of Congress or of the legislature or clicking on something, but usually requires engaging in public debate with others in a constructive way. It requires organizing. If citizens are better organized, they can more effectively pursue and promote their ideas, their values, and challenge those things that go against the views they have. So I would say if we manage to get clear, concise, and as true as possible information, and use that, all the fact checking and the efforts that are made to democratize communications and factual discussion of policy issues. If we get more people to feel that it does make a difference if they show up to elections or not. When we see countries where you have, and this, as in the US and other countries in Chile, the freedom to vote, you get participation of probably 50 to 60%. In countries with compulsory voting, like Argentina and others have, you still get participations of 80% of people voting. This current election after pandemic, that was down to 70. And in countries with voluntary participation, it's barely over the 60s. So if you imagine that split between two parties in any of the countries that we're talking about, and 60% of people vote or 65, it means that two parties are splitting 30% of the vote, 35% of the vote, maybe 40. It means that 4 out of 10 people are sort of making the decision for the other whole, the full 100. And I think just as much as that is part of the arithmetic of democracy, the more people get involved, especially from underrepresented groups, sometimes women, sometimes indigenous populations, sometimes youth, the richer our democratic practice might be. And lastly, I do feel one of the things all those of us who are over our 50s or over our 40s need to do is to promote, support, try to ignite the involvement of our younger generation in the under 25s and 30s. These people represent sometimes, 30 to 40% of the electorate. In countries like mine and others, they represent the most vulnerable and the voices that are least heard in our political debate. When you look at the average age of our legislators or the people in executive positions, they are governing for about 30% of the people who are not usually represented, at least even in their voice. And there is more we can do. So I would say for citizens, get informed, try to engage in some of the democratic institutions that your community, country, or state allows and fosters, and then take an active role in participating in the civic part of politics. Even if you don't want to take a partisan role, there is still much to do in terms of keeping the transparency of elections, holding institutions accountable to the decisions they make, and overall having the voice of people heard. Much of our independence in Latin America over the past 2 centuries was built upon the idea of bringing more power to the people. It seems as if we've taken that for granted, and we leave that to the 10% or 5% of people who do politics. We need more people engaged, especially again at the local and state levels, to be able to make a difference in how we govern ourselves and how the institutions sustain themselves through time.
Thank you very much. What do you view as the biggest current obstacle to democratic renewal in Latin America?
I would see two. One is the very usual ambition of those in office to try to hold on to their positions in power and to shift or alter or modify the institutions, be this a constitution or the laws that limit re-elections, that limit or put term limits. So we've seen examples of this in many places where either constitutions were reformed to allow for third mandates or for continued possibilities for those in power. But at the same time, if the laws and the constitutions are sometimes being affected by certain parties or people who want to remain in power, we're not seeing a challenge to those situations from the citizenry or from civil society or from other parties to be as strong as that. And so we see cases like, we can check in Nicaragua and Salvador and other countries where these shifts are managed by a political sector, even between those in power and those that are out of power, but without healthy or as strong as debate to minimize how much the rules of the games are changed to benefit those in power. So that's one definite challenge. The other, as I mentioned earlier, is to get more people involved. And to get more people involved, not only calling, as your second question did, on what can be done to improve or strengthen the quality of our democratic institutions and practices, but to dismantle the obstacles to democratic renewal. One of the obstacles is making the playing field as level as possible, and so this affects campaign financing, how the media is offered to the different political parties, how the judicial branch acts to either allow or forbid candidates to run for office at the local or the state level, how in some countries criminal organizations or para-state organizations threaten opposition leaders, be them drug-related issues in Mexico or Colombia or in other countries. So there's still a lot of room for improvement, but that room for improvement requires collective action, shared understanding that regardless of the results of our electoral processes, sustaining democracy and sustaining the way in which we get along with each other is more important than who wins a given election. And those things that are more taken for granted in, I would say, the north side of America or in Europe still have a long way to go in Latin America. We have done a huge advance. It is worth celebrating that we do have years of sustained democratic practice and elections, and that the results usually have been respected. But we do see backslides every once in a while. And I feel that currently, as we enter this new decade between 2020 and 2030, there is work to be done to strengthen the alternation of power between different parties, to allow new voices into the political system, to empower youth and women and indigenous groups to participate at the different levels of government and governance. So I would say those are two of the clear obstacles, those that want to remain in power and the lack of taking a stronger stance by those who care about democratic renewal, democratic governance, not leave only in the hands of politicians the sustaining of our democratic practices. It also has to be something that society and civil society takes on to try to feel that it does make a difference. It does make a difference to have budgets, to have transparency, to have laws that are not only drafted but then complied with. And I would say there are a few very admirable cases that we can look forward to in Latin America and to think the homework has been done. In many of our other countries, I would say in 10 or 12, we still have a long way to go to ensure that the next generation has a better democracy than the current one has, which is obviously much better than the previous generation had.
Thank you. Now, we've been discussing some of the challenges to democracy in Latin America, but where have been some of the success stories? In what countries in the region do you feel democracy is thriving?
So thriving is a difficult word. I would say definitely some of the countries that have been more stable. Uruguay represented an interesting case. Costa Rica is an interesting case. But if we look at several of the other countries, even if they had formal transitions in power, there are still some of these signals that are worrying with the situation that we've seen over the past few years, I would say, with presidents and former presidents ending up in prison or challenged, not knowing if they could run for elections or they couldn't, all the way from Brazil to Bolivia to Peru. Um, the other aspect that does bring me hope is that even when polarization um, becomes stronger and there is less middle ground and more extremes to the left and to the right, or more populist um, expressions, the level of engagement of those less centered or the most extreme position. No one could say that the process that's going on in Chile was not rich in its democratic expressions. We have a strong left candidate, we have a strong right candidate, we had a constitutional process going through, and it has all happened within the rules of engagement. So some of those things, even if they light up a yellow sort of light for concern, or a sense that the difficulty when very extreme parties come into government, or less moderate parties come into government, sometimes the dialogue can be challenged. So one of the things we want to work on in general in the region is to getting more people of different views to share objectives of where their respective countries have to go. And there is more to be done there. A very nice example I'm always appreciative of is having two former presidents of Uruguay, Jose Mujica on the left side, or Sanguinetti on the right side. And both these people in the Senate coming to reasonable debate positions, retiring or leaving politics with recognition and with value on the other side. So I think some of these better practices are aspirations for many of our other countries, and that we go through a process where less of our politicians end up behind bars, in jail, or prosecuted, either for good or made up reasons, but that we have a more civil construction and engagement within the political class and outside in civil society. And that the three branches of government, where we have a more Republican setup, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, try to think more in terms of the next generations and not only in terms of the next elections.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to remind our audience you can submit your own questions at ccga.live. Turning to our next question, Nico, you've spent the last 30 years working to strengthen civil society and democratic institutions in Argentina. Can you tell us more about the state of democracy in Argentina specifically, and some of the lessons you learned from your work both to strengthen democracy and as an elected official?
Thank you for that question. My concern, and those of several of my generation, I would say 20 years behind, was that Argentina is one of these strange countries where we had a very significant opportunity to progress, to advance. We happened to have in the early 20th century a level of very respectable development and improvement of the stakes of those who came to our country or who were born and raised here. And somewhere along the lines, after the 30s and 40s of last century, we seem to have lost our way. 50% of our people live in poverty. Our institutions have been, in some cases, weakened, not strengthened. We have sustained 30 and now soon in the next few years, 40 years of democratic practice, but without delivering results of more equity and equality, more opportunities for growth and progress, the sense that someone's children will know as much or more than the parents knew, or will be in a better opportunity, or have more opportunities. So democracy, to some extent, doesn't seem to have delivered some of the goods that are expected in terms of bringing more equality, more opportunities to people. And one of the early diagnoses several of us have had of that was that we needed to improve public policies, that there needed to be better bridges built between those in government from different political parties to agree on issues of investment in education, how to address health policy, how to sustain more constructive relationships between those in government and those in opposition, and that we respect the independence of the judiciary, that we understand the balance between minorities and majorities in the use of power. So that understanding that with better policies, we would be able to advance the progress that was needed over the last 30 years proved insufficient. We've learned from better places, more positive experience within and outside of Argentina. We've looked at what has worked all the way from science to poverty reduction. We've looked at things from macroeconomic policies to judicial reform. And nevertheless, I probably cannot say that we've improved as much as we need to improve. We are still far behind in several areas, although, again, life expectancies, education opportunities have expanded, the chances of having better gender equality in represented in government, but also in society overall, has worked out well. But um, first thing we've tried and needed to improve is to have more consistent fact-based public policy and healthy discussions in Congress and Parliament among the different parties to make that into longer term policies and not just short-term solutions that get us out of a specific problem or challenge. The second evolution of that understanding of democracy in Argentina over the past 30 years was trying to get more people to want to participate in politics, to try to get more people to believe that it is useful to participate in the electoral process, to voice your opinions, to hold those in government accountable to what they do or say. And that next stage over a bit, I would say between 2010 and 2020 for me was much about strengthening democracy at the local level, to get more people involved and get more transparency developed and more public institutions to become open to citizens and neighbors so that their voices could be heard, and that the state or the government would go out and try to actively listen and not just build policy with or by listening or by getting engaging the smaller core of people who are particularly knowledgeable or practice or experience in democracy and public policy. So the second challenge has been of expanding the voices of those that are underrepresented and engaging more people in the civic process. The limit I found to that, and that several of my colleagues have found to that, is that we haven't done things well enough to get more youth mobilized and more women into positions of power that are not the wives of, the daughters of, or the acquaintances of. And having said that, we have wonderful and very accomplished women in politics. We need more of the other tiers of society, unions, chambers of commerce, the corporate sector, civil society, more represented by youth and women and indigenous populations. So I would say that's a next stage of evolution, is getting more people to believe that if they had the chance to influence the policy debate as they do, things could become better. It is this fundamental belief in democracy that each of us can make a difference, that if elections were decided by one vote, one way or another, then our vote does make a very significant difference, and that participative thing matters. So I think the current challenge for Argentina is to try to build a bridge between the more extreme positions that sometimes we fall into, this cleavage that has been constructed by politics into society, that you're either with one party or with the other, when in truth there are probably many points that bring us together and have us in common, but sometimes politics, populism, extremism, and also much of the use of fake news, part of how the media takes positions, hasn't been constructive to binding more Argentines together. So in a nutshell, I would say we still have lots of homework to do in improving public policies, in getting better people into politics. And what I mean by better is people from more diverse backgrounds, people with more diverse experiences that believe that the political process is worthy. And third, sharing this with another generation that is getting into the public arena and that deserves the opportunity of expressing the views of what their future is going to be like in the next 15 to 20 years.
Thank you very much. And now looking regionally, I want to dig a little bit deeper into your point about getting more women and youth and underrepresented groups involved. What are some of the specific steps that can be taken to make democracy more inclusive and representative throughout Latin America?
So I'll mention three. One is definitely on the side of government and the state, regardless of who is in power at a given time. But the state is definitely one of the places that can open more doors for these disadvantaged or underrepresented groups. There is something you can do from the supply side of politics and policy, which is invite, challenge, bring into the conversation many of those that are affected by the decisions that we currently take. And that process, the door is definitely somewhat opened, and this varies from country to country, but there is more we can do to sort of open both doors and have more of these underrepresented groups use their voice, use their votes. So the processes of inviting younger people to participate in the public debate or to have underrepresented groups does have one side that can be affected by positive government engagement, governments that are more transparent, more open, more that listen better to their constituencies, definitely provide part of the pathway for that positive evolution. The second thing is just like if you provide, the best service of doctors or nurses out there, but if the person that is sick does not approach the hospital or the health center, then the interaction does not happen. And it's the same if you have governments that are very open and they say, come, let's have a conversation about what's the best way to develop, whatever sustainable policies for climate change in a challenging region. If people don't come, then that open door doesn't work. So the second thing we need to do is to promote more participation, more empowerment. And for that to happen, people that decide to leave the site and get into the public discussion have to feel that it's safe, that they will not be prosecuted, harmed, or their reputations destroyed by trying to express their views. And sometimes this is what some of our governments in Latin America do, and they are aggressively attacking those who express different views. And sometimes it's the own political process, not even those in power. Those in power sometimes suffer the criticism, the extreme criticism by those out of power. So a second part of what needs to be done is to get more of those up underrepresented groups to believe that it does make a difference and that the public space can be a safe space where to share your views and help build a better outcome for your community and your society. So those are two things that can be done within communities or within countries. Then there is a third, which is what the rest of the region and the rest of the international community can do to promote more of the better practices of democracy. And there, I would say three things have proved to make some of a difference. One is the international organizations where we belong to, be this the UN, be this the Organization of American States, but sometimes it's with electoral observations, sometimes it's with preparing reports on the state of human rights or security issues or food security in the region. So international organizations can play a role. The other countries in the region can play supportive roles when democracy is more challenged, be this with voice or with actions. And so that's the second part of what the international community can do, not only from outside of Latin America, but also from within Latin America, those countries that do believe that it does make a difference to express your views on the government practices of other countries can use their voice to expect that it is important to respect institutions, to respect human rights, to respect the rule of law. So that's the second, third. And the third thing that we're seeing, and that is something where the Chicago Council has been at the forefront, is the role of cities. And this not only depend now of what national administrations or Ministry of Foreign Affairs do or say, but also you have more mayors coming together to address common challenges, to figure out new ways to improve or address climate change issues, or you have more governments coming together to exchange issues on youth involvement, science and technology. So there is something about subnational governments also being able to bond, build brotherhoods or sisterhoods, to be able to build better relationships. I've had a wonderful opportunity of learning from Medellin in Colombia, looking at interesting stuff about transport in Porto Alegre, in Brazil. So if more of these subnational experiences of quality democracy are sustained through time, then we build bridges through which people can walk with more security in terms of building better and stronger democracies in the region.
Thank you very much. We'll be turning to audience questions in just a moment. And as a reminder to our audience, you can submit those at ccga.live. One final question from me. What has been the COVID-19 pandemic's effect on democracy and governance in Latin America?
Um, uh, Again, a pendulum. On one side, at the beginning of the pandemics, when there was less knowledge about what was going on, what the consequences were, how long they would last, when we were challenged by the infodemia of uncertain information circulating about what works, what didn't work. But we did see three important things for democracy. One is that in most places, the decisions by national administrations and state administrations were heard or heeded to by society, and where there were voices of disagreement, they were expressed. So this was a rich exercise on debating policy. You have parent worrying about if their kids were in school or not, and voicing that and actively engaging in different countries about should kids be back in school or not. You had labor unions and chambers of commerce arguing about how much did it make sense to close down the economies or to allow more flexible or more control and responsible administration of the COVID-19 situation. So it did provide an opportunity to rethink the public debate or to re-engage in public debate in several countries and across generations. Sometimes the perspective of older people who at the beginning seemed to be more challenged by COVID-19 was not the same response as younger generations. As vaccination improved in the region, people that were over 60s or 70s got vaccinated first, so they started to feel that they were more protected than than people that were 15, 16, or 17. So I think the one aspect of what COVID and the pandemic generated was a renewed debate about what governments ought to be doing or not doing. And I feel that this had an impact when it was discussed in a family dinner table. It was discussed in a football club. It was discussed at the after a church service, or it was discussed in a women's group, where the question of adequate freedoms, adequate responsibilities, vaccination or not, became part of public debate. So that was one positive thing. The second, which was challenging, is that the time of quarantine meant that many people were off the streets in several countries, and being off the streets implied losing public space. It's as if public space were moved online. Most of our debates for 6, 8, 9 months were happening as we are today over Zoom, or they were having conversations between political leaders and their constituencies were moved online. And there is something about losing out on the physical presence, on the community building aspects of the engaging with others that are different from me and don't participate in the same conversations, that was lost. So I think there is some renewal, fresh renewal that is happening after that. And hopefully our return to a more normal situation might happen again without the fourth or fifth or sixth wave of COVID being more restrictive, but that people don't remain as indoors. Just to make a clear example, many many of the jobs that people have both in the public and private sector were moved offline, were moved online, and people stopped going to an office or a building or a place of work. And now we're moving back slowly. In many countries or in many cities, it's happening 2 days a week, 3 days a week. In that re-engaging with more public arenas, more neighborhood meetings, I hope that our democratic institutions are not left behind. That if people decide that they go less time to the office for work, that they still decide to show up to a community meeting about how we improve security in our neighborhood, or that they show up for things as didn't happen. It did work on Zoom, it did work on WhatsApp, but was a lack of face-to-face engagement that surely now can be addressed. And the third and last comment I'll make with this is that any threat, as COVID was, usually empowers executive branches. And it also empowers certain institutions, the health institutions, for example. And a return to normality would also imply a return to a more civilized and equal conversation between those that have to make decisions in a crisis and those that have to live with the decisions during the crisis. So between citizens and politicians, between those that are governed and those who govern, that we rebalance our relationship and have more of a horizontal coming together.
Thank you so much. Turning now to an audience question. In what countries in Latin America are you most concerned about the state of democracy, and what might the new year hold for them?
So I would say in countries, definitely in part of Central America, I feel that there are challenges of the same uh, aspects that was mentioned earlier, where institutions can be challenged, democratic institutions can be challenged by those in power to minimize the possibility of democratic alternation. And so there are some countries, we've mentioned a few of those: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, question marks on some others of their neighboring countries. So that, I think, is one of the countries that are concerns. The extreme polarizations or very strong polarizations or unhealthy polarizations that we have seen in Brazil, in Argentina, potentially in Chile are reason for concern. The same is true for Bolivia. So there are other countries there that also have challenges of how do you, in a civilized way, come to agreements with people that represent very different views than your own or very different constituencies than your own. And usually the political system has to be part of the solution, not to increase the problem of how different voices come to agreement for the progress of our citizenry. So I would say those are some of the countries where I see concerns, but I also see reason for hope when we see that elections are held, even through the pandemics, that changes in power do come to place, and hopefully that those that come into power can have the attitude of building with their adversaries and not with wanting to exclude them from the democratic process.
Thank you. Now, our next question from the audience. You mentioned fact checking in policy discussions. What can democracies to combat disinformation?
I've seen it close over the past 7 or 8 years. I think if we look at 8 years ago, we didn't even know what fact checking was. It wasn't part of the political debate. If the government or the news said something, the consumer or the audience tended to believe that. And the wonderful enhancement of our civic abilities to challenge what leaders in the public discourse say, to see if that's true or not, if it is fact based or not, has given us the possibility of having more tools at hand. But the ways in which, especially social networks, facilitate or promote communication have also made it easier for fake news to spread. So, one of the things that fact based and fact checking based policy discussions still has to do is to educate people into not believing what they hear at first sight from politicians, experts, the media, and trying to see what information is behind that, and really try to make fact checking something that is more part of a new generation or a regular practice. Is not take for granted whatever I read on Facebook or Instagram or see in a TikTok or Twitter expression, but rather say, what is another point of view? Is this position that I'm hearing sustained by facts or not? But it is asking the question. And asking the question doesn't imply that one has to always seek for the answers oneself, but it does mean asking an expert or two, going to a fact checking organization and saying, could you fact check this? You know, the government says that, or the opposition says X, Y, Z. What information is available that can help us address this? So I would say the three things that are required are that there is a bigger interest in people or consumers of information in asking if what they're reading, what they're sharing, or what they're seeing has sustainable evidence behind it, and looking for that information. The second is sustaining the existence of organizations that do fact checking. These are usually a mixture of journalists and civil society activists who come together to defend uh, all the way from freedom of expression, like we see in the case of Maria Ressa in the Philippines, and different people who have been nominated either for international recognition on their defense of freedom of speech, freedom of information, but also we do see it in the practice of these fact-checking organizations slightly modifying the way politicians express themselves in public. It does not feel the same for a political leader if after he expresses something, there is out in the news outlets that it's a fake statement or that there is no support for that. So there is also more cared or considered expressions by public leaders in the public arena. And that does build a better democracy, and it does make our public debate more sustainable when we can debate on truth and not on made up fictions. So the second thing is sustaining the engagement of organizations. And the third is that there is an adequate international connection between these organizations, because if a news came out in the pandemic that certain vaccine was produced on healthy results, or that certain cure by drinking, whatever tea or hot water, you could cure yourself, that fake news probably circulated in 10 different countries in Latin America. So you don't need 10 organizations working to uncover the truth behind that or to say true or false. You just need connections among them, where someone in Mexico has come up with an adequate analysis of what might be true about a public statement or a piece of news that is out there, then someone in Brazil can use that same information, or someone in Colombia. So I think these are some of the things that are new events or evolutions in our democratic practice. The whole idea of the influence of social networks and the challenges they bring to your worldviews or perspectives. We tend to believe and take for granted those things that are expressed by people that we agree with, and we tend to disbelieve those things that come from other sources. So we have to do this internal effort of being more balanced in our views, not in what we necessarily what we say, but how we are informed. It's as if we all understand that what we eat affects our body, and so we try to be, in some sense, careful or considerate about the nutrition in our diets. We're not as good in doing that in our mental nutrition, in how we consume information, in what we read, what we where we are informed or how we're informed. So we can still do more to ensure that fact-checking organizations are sustained through time, that it becomes more of a practice in the younger generation and in the broad citizenry, and that the international connections among organizations that try to defend truth in public debate become stronger and more effective.
Thank you so much. Nico, unfortunately, we're nearly out of time. I want to thank you so much for sharing your insight with our audience today. I'd also like to extend our thanks again to Rob and Kitty Lansing and the whole host committee for the Hart Program Series for making this program possible today. A copy of the recording will be posted to the Council's YouTube page, and we hope you'll share that with your friends, family, and network. Again, Nico, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have future events of the Council to look forward to.